Have you ever wondered why revolutions are often born out of rage? Why do oppressed people across history and geography rise up and fight back? Picture this. You are at a marketplace. One side is bustling with shops filled with luxurious goods, bright lights, and laughter. The other side is a slum, barely surviving, children running barefoot, families struggling for food. Now you cannot help but feel the stark difference, the inequality etched in every corner. Now imagine the people in the slum suddenly deciding enough is enough. They rise, they fight, and demand their share of the world. This exact scenario reflects the essence of Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, which is a powerful work that unravels the violent and transformative process of decolonization. Fanon shows us how colonialism is not just about land, it is about dehumanization, it is about exploitation, and it is about psychological control. He argues that liberation does not come with polite requests. It comes with resistance, which is often violent, that shakes the very foundation of oppression. Now we are going to discuss the themes that Fanon has focused in this book. The first one is the role of violence in decolonization. Fanon begins by making a very bold claim. He says that decolonization is always violent. Now, you might ask, why violence? Can't liberation happen peacefully? Let me break it down. Colonialism itself is violent. It is not just about soldiers and guns. It is about taking land, erasing cultures, and stripping people of their humanity. Here's an example. Imagine someone taking over your home, dictating where you sleep, what you eat, and even what language you speak. Would you politely ask them to leave? Similarly, Fanon argues that reclaiming your home requires force because colonial powers don't give up control willingly. He likens this to a tug of war. When one side pulls hard, the other must pull harder to win. Fanon also emphasizes that violence is not just destructive, it is transformative. It helps the oppressed reclaim their dignity and humanity. Think about the Indian independence movement. While it had non-violent leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, there were also revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose who believed in using force. However, both approaches aimed for the same goal, that is freedom. Now let's discuss the second point, the divided world of the colonizer and the colonized. Fanon points the colonial world as a place split into two, the colonizer's town and the colonized's town. Imagine this. There are two towns. One is like a luxurious gated community, clean streets, big houses, and a life of comfort. People there eat well, sleep well, and never worry about basic needs. This is the colonizer's town. Now, picture another town right next to it. It is overcrowded, it is dirty and chaotic. Houses are made of scraps, people don't have enough to eat, and there's no electricity or clean water. This is the colonized town. Fanon describes this as a world split into two, both physically and mentally. The colonizer's world is full of privilege, while the colonized live in constant struggle. And here's the thing, it's not just about poverty, it is about being made to feel less than human. Think about apartheid South Africa. The white minority lived in cities with all the luxuries, while the black people were pushed into neglected townships. Schools for black children were underfunded, jobs were restricted, and they were not even allowed to freely move around without passbooks. This was not just physical separation, it was a system designed to make them feel inferior. But Fanon does not stop there. He says that this division creates tension, a constant push and pull. The colonized looked at the colonizers and think, why do they have everything and we have nothing? This envy and anger grow over time, and the colonizers, on the other hand, live in fear. They know that the colonized are watching them and dreaming of taking their place. And this creates a ticking time bomb. Fanon argues that the colonized won't just settle for equality. They want to take back what's been stolen. Think about the Haitian Revolution, where enslaved people rose up, overthrew their French colonizers, and claimed their independence. That's the kind of explosion Fanon talks about, when years of oppression and anger finally boil over. The next point is the pitfalls of national consciousness. Now let's talk about what happens after independence. Fanon issues a strong warning here. He says that just because a country gains freedom does not mean that the people are truly liberated. But why? Because sometimes the colonizers leave, but the system of exploitation stays the same, just under new management. Imagine this. A country fights hard for independence, but once it is free, the leaders who take over live in luxury, big mansions, fancy cars, while the majority of the population continues to struggle. These leaders are the native bourgeoisie, and they simply replace the colonizers without changing the system. It's like swapping out the players in a game but keeping the unfair rules intact. Fanon gives examples from post-independence Africa. In many cases, newly formed governments did not focus on the welfare of the people. Instead, leaders prioritized their own power and wealth. They struck deals with foreign powers, maintained economic systems that favored the elite, and left the majority of their citizens in poverty. Fanon calls this a betrayal of the revolution. Take Algeria, for instance. The country fought a brutal war of independence against French colonizers. But after the independence, some leaders became more interested in maintaining their own status rather than addressing the needs of the rural masses who had fought for freedom. The wealth of the nation stayed concentrated in the hands of a few, leaving the majority of the people. Fanon argues that true liberation is not just about removing the colonizers. It is about dismantling the systems of oppression they left behind. He compares it to pulling weeds from a garden. If you only cut off the tops, the weeds will grow back. You have to dig out the roots. That means overhauling the political, economic, and societal structures. Let me give you a modern analogy. Think of a company where the boss is abusive and unfair. The employees finally get rid of the boss and hire a new one. But the new boss keeps the same toxic policies in place. Has anything really changed? No. Fanon says that for independence to have real meaning, the entire system must change. He also points out how dangerous it is when the native bourgeoisie adopts the colonizer's mindset. Instead of uniting the country, they create divisions between the rich and the poor, between urban and rural areas, between different ethnic groups, all to maintain control. This weakens the unity of the people and makes the country vulnerable to exploitation by foreign powers. Fanon warns against systems where wealth and power remain concentrated in the hands of a few, leaving the majority behind. So the question we must ask ourselves is, are we building a system that uplifts everyone, or are we just changing the players while the rules of inequality stay the same? In short, Fanon warns us that independence is not the finish line, it is just the beginning. True freedom requires hard work to build a fair and just society where everyone, not just the elite, can thrive. The next point is rediscovering national culture. Here's a question for you. What happens to a country's culture under colonial rule? Fanon has a very clear answer. Colonizers don't just take land and resources, they attack culture. They dismiss native traditions, languages, and art as backward and inferior. This is the same thing that I've also discussed in Edward Said's Orientalism. Over time, this creates a psychological impact. Colonized people start believing these lies, losing pride in their heritage and adopting the colonizer's culture as superior. Let me give you an example. Fanon describes how the colonized begin to see their own traditions as shameful. Take native languages. Under colonial rule, people are often forced to speak the colonizer's language, like the English or French, because it is seen as a language of progress. As a result, younger generations stop learning their mother tongue, and over time, the native language and the culture it represents starts to disappear. Now let's think about how this impacts identity. Imagine growing up hearing that your traditional clothing, songs, or festivals are uncivilized or backward or inferior. Fanon argues that this is not just cultural erasure, it is a form of psychological control. By making the colonized feel inferior, the colonizers ensure compliance and prevent resistance. But here's where it gets interesting. Fanon says that during the struggle for liberation, people begin to rediscover their culture. But why? Because reclaiming culture becomes an act of defiance. It's a way of saying we are not what you say we are. We have our own identity and we are proud of it. For example, in The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon talks about how colonized artists, writers, and intellectuals reconnect with their roots during the fight for freedom. They reject the colonizers' standards and start creating art, music, and literature that reflect their own experiences. Think of it like this. A poet who once wrote in French might start writing in their native languages, drawing on local traditions and themes. This is not just art, it is resistance. Now let me bring a real-world parallel. During the Indian independence movement, figures like Rabindranath Tagore and Mahatma Gandhi emphasized the importance of Indian culture. Mahatma Gandhi wore khadi handspun cloth as a rejection of British industrial goods. Tagore's writings celebrated Indian traditions while also critiquing colonialism. Think about his novel Gora, think about his novel Ghore Baire. These cultural symbols were not just about aesthetics, they were political statements that inspired unity and pride among Indians. Fanon also warns us about something important here. He says that while reconnecting with culture is powerful, we should not romanticize the past. Some leaders and intellectuals retreat into a kind of nostalgia, glorifying everything traditional while ignoring the need for progress. Fanon argues that true liberation involves using culture as a tool for building the future, not as an escape to the past. Think of it like this. It is about going back to the way things were before colonization. It is about taking what's valuable from the past and blending it with new ideas to create something unique. For example, post-independence African nations often used traditional art forms to express modern political struggles, creating something both rooted in history and relevant to the present. The final point is colonial war and mental disorders. Let's think about this. What happens to people, both the oppressed and the oppressors, when violence becomes a part of everyday life? Fanon, being a psychiatrist who worked with patients during the Algerian War of Independence, shows us that colonization is not just about land and resources. It deeply wounds the human mind. Fanon treated many Algerians who suffered from unimaginable violence, torture, beatings, and dehumanization at the hands of the French. For example, imagine a young man who is arrested and tortured because he is suspected of being part of the resistance. He is beaten, humiliated, and made to feel like he is less than human. When he is finally released, he is alive. But he is not the same. He struggles with nightmares, fear, and a sense of helplessness. Now think about the long-term effects of this. Such trauma does not just go away, it festers. A person who has been tortured might carry that pain for years, and it can affect their family, their relationships, and even their community. Fanon calls this the psychological fallout of colonial violence. But here's the twist. It is not just the colonized who suffer. Fanon also talks about the French soldiers. Many of them were ordered to carry out acts of brutality, like torturing prisoners, killing civilians, and while some followed orders without question, others were haunted by guilt. Fanon treated soldiers who had mental breakdowns because they could not reconcile their actions and their sense of morality. Imagine being a soldier ordered to burn down a village or torture a prisoner, and then living with those memories for the rest of your life. Fanon describes this as a vicious cycle of violence. The colonizers use violence to maintain control, but that same violence damages them. On the other hand, the colonized often internalize their pain, turning it into self-doubt or even self-destruction. He gives examples of communities where people, unable to fight back directly against colonizers, turned on each other. Tribal feuds, family conflicts, and even random acts of violence. And one striking case Fanon mentions is a man who, after years of oppression, brutally killed his own friend during an argument over something trivial. Why? Because the anger and frustration he felt toward the colonizers had no outlet and it spilled over into his personal relationships. Fanon says that this is how colonialism corrupts the very fabric of society. Fanon also discusses how colonized people, in their attempt to cope, sometimes escape into traditions, religions, or rituals. For instance, he describes how some Algerians turned to spiritual possession or trances as a way to express their suppressed anger and grief. While these practices gave temporary relief, they also reflected the deep psychological scars left by the colonialism. Here's another layer. Fanon says that during the liberation struggle, these psychological pain starts to transform. The colonized begin to direct their anger outward towards the colonizers. In this way, the fight for independence is not just political, it is deeply personal. It is a way of healing the mind and reclaiming dignity. Think of it like this. Imagine someone who has been bullied for years finally standing up to their bully. That act of defiance is not just about stopping the bullying, it's about regaining self-respect. Fanon argues that the process of fighting back helps the colonized to rebuild their sense of self. But he also warns us. The psychological scars of colonization don't disappear after independence. Generations carry the trauma forward. Even today, in post-colonial societies, we can see the lingering effects of this violence in social divisions, mistrust, and the struggle to rebuild a collective identity. Therefore, Fanon's message is clear. Colonization is not just physical, it is a mental and emotional war. And while liberation can begin the healing process, the wounds run deep, often taking decades, even centuries, to fully heal. With this, Fanon ends with a powerful message. He says, do not mimic Europe. Do not imitate Europe. He argues that Europe's greed and exploitation have led it to moral and spiritual crisis. Instead, newly independent nations should chart their own path that is rooted in humanity and equality. He says, we must create a new world, and that is the essence of the Wretched of the Earth, a call to break free from oppression, reclaim dignity, and rebuild a just society. With this, I would wrap up by saying that The Wretched of the Earth is not just a book. It's a mirror that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, oppression, and freedom. And if you think that this video has helped you in any way or the other, do like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.